you very much, President, members, and presumably a few guests as well. Thank you very much for coming this evening. I hope you can all hear me. If not, please wave and I'll speak a little louder as well. I'm sorry it's not a very exciting title. I wasn't quite certain how I should phrase it, but never mind. We'll get on with the story. And just for those of you that are interested in North Uist and the Hebrides, this is a picture of the site I'm going to be talking about, which was about there. When Ian Crawford, who was the excavator and originator of the project, the Udal project in the North Uist area, when he started work there, which was in about 1963, he worked for 32 years in this area. At the time, it was probably one of the largest rural sites ever dug in Scotland. It was certainly, and I think still remains, one of the longest archaeological projects ever undertaken in Scotland. And this year it's 55 years since it was started. And unfortunately, it's possibly one of the largest backlog. I prefer to use the word backlog than legacy. Legacy always implies that you're going to get something good out of it. And that's debatable, but we'll talk about that as we go. So it's one of the largest that's still not been fully published. So my story interweaves Ian Crawford, who was one of the most enigmatic men in Scottish archaeology, into the story of the site I'm going to tell you about. And I'm going to end with what he found on some of the other sites, on our hopes for the future and what we think we can achieve. So, without any more ado, let's get, do not touch the mouse, I've been told. Right. Hebrides, you can see where we are, right up here, very tip of, almost of North Uist. For those of you that have been there, you will know this as an area of outstanding natural beauty. Unfortunately, the green map does not explain the extent of sand on both sides of the peninsula that are there at low tide. And I want you to remember that in a few moments, that the sand extends for kilometres out to sea, but it's very flat and very low-lying. The maca, as it's called, it's the shell sand. It's a very fertile sand, made the area very fertile, in contrast to the rather rugged and bare, peaty hills inland. And it is an island of contrasts, more so than South Uist, obviously to the south. So this area of fertile sand attracted settlement, and especially prehistoric settlement. And modern day settlement actually lies out with the area of sand, more or less on the very edge of it. And now let me introduce you to Ian Crawford. I don't know how old he was there, probably 30s, probably approaching 40. You will see the bare foot of the person that he was talking to. I didn't quite manage to remove all of her from the image. But the bare foot's important because, forget about health and safety. This site, with it being a sand site, a very fragile site, could not be excavated wearing steel-toe cap boots. You would have taken it away and eroded it. So they often worked in socks or bare feet, which would not be necessarily acceptable today. But the other little story, you can see on here, on the improvised table, this was at the end of a working day, and if anybody had found something that Ian Crawford thought was worthy of a dram, he would get out his bottles of, well, spirits, and the person could have a dram, or the excavator, or the volunteer, whoever it was, got a dram. The unfortunate thing was the rest of the company did not receive a dram. The other excavators had to wait because it was quite a long walk home, about 4 or 5 kilometres down to where the accommodation was in an old school. And so, yes, if somebody did find something, they were, oh no, what are the rest going to think, having to wait for their supper and to get cleaned up. So it was these little tales I have acquired from various people who've worked there or worked there in the past. Now, the origins of the project are very interesting because Ian Crawford, he was a historian by nature and I would say an archaeologist by training. And he lived for quite a while in the Hebrides. He learnt Gaelic. He had a vast interest in place names, documentary evidence, oral traditions, and the Udal area, that peninsula, fitted something he was looking for, and that was continuity of settlement. He wanted to prove that settlement continued in the Maca areas right back into prehistory. The Udal has documentary evidence, and I'll show you a little bit of that at the time. The other thing that spurred Ian Crawford on was a book called North Uist, published in 1911 by a man, a big landowner at the time, called Erskine Beveridge. He also was an amateur photographer, and some of his photographs at the time are quite important. And he had noticed in his ramblings around the Maca that there was evidence for earlier occupation or occupation of this area. So to bring those all together made Crawford very interested in actually starting to undertake fieldwork in this area. He was also at this time employed by the School of Scottish Studies attached to Edinburgh University. Now, I think this is one of the earliest photographs I have remaining from 1963, or probably a year or so later, sorry about that, about 1965. He concocted a greenhouse as a fines hut. You can see the tents, the old Land Rover which he preferred, and in order to put this into some other type of context, every year for 31 years Ian Crawford would go from somewhere like Cambridge, latterly from Edinburgh and then Dumfries, with his family, with his 2 dogs, with all the equipment, the fines bags, you name it. He would travel up and down to North Uist with his family and then return bearing probably a trailer with fines and samples and goodness knows what else. But at the time he started, there was no supermarket. There would have been a butcher's. We know we've got receipts from the butcher saying, Mr. Crawford, your bill is overdue. He was a very enterprising man. It was not an easy journey, and it was certainly not easy for the volunteers that came from all parts of the world to come and dig with him. So that's a little bit of the background of the story. And then I come into it in about 2002. I met Ian Crawford for the second time. Somebody brought him to my office in Glasgow University, and he opened his attache case, and all these papers suddenly went right across the desk of my papers, and we thought, right, we have a problem here. And from that inauspicious beginning, we developed a friendship, and I was invited to the house, and I went to see what he had of the archives and a collection of the Udal excavations. Now, this doesn't look like much, but what we did manage to achieve was that, and I'll show you a little bit more about the paperwork in a few moments. I brought one of these with me. You can have a look at it afterwards if you wish. This is going to the library here in the Society of Antiquaries. Certainly not carrying it all the way home. It's heavy, but that's the product of what we have managed to do for the smallest of the Udal sites. Now, when I went to visit him, he lived in a very large detached house, and the basement had 3 or 4 aisles and going underneath the house. And they were absolutely full of every conceivable type of packaging material you can imagine. They were full of finds and samples that had never seen the light of day from the day they were excavated to the day they were put away under the basement. So if you can imagine that, and the Hague whiskey boxes, the red and white ones there, we had probably between 80 and over 100 of those. There were apple racks, fish boxes, tea chests, sacks, you name it, it was there. It was, I had to sort of crawl through this to try and assess how much there was in volume. It was very difficult. And over time, although I worked with him in Crawford for a number of years trying to bring some of the what we know as RUX-6, the smallest site, to publication, he became increasingly unwell, and he ended up in a home. But his wife said, "Will you please come and get this collection? If not..." So I thought, well, we can't have the if not, we better get moving. And I ended up getting 40 cubic meters of material from the basement. Now, 40 cubic meters is quite a lot, and if you can imagine, from the nearest pillar to you to the wall, and about 2 meters high, that's about the size of the container that this material now sits in. So from a disoriented pile of bags and goodness knows what else, we now have something that's not necessarily in ideal conditions, but at least it's preservable and rat-proof and mouse-proof over in a container. And these are just the samples, I hasten to add, not the artefacts. On the left-hand side, that is all animal bone, fish bone, and across the back, that's from the largest of the Udal sites, which I'll mention a bit later on. And on the right-hand side are 250,000 sherds of pottery from the largest site as well. So some of this is still in its, well, in fact most of it's still in its original finds bags. So, because I reckon it would take 2 years just to go through all the animal bone, and then there's the pottery as well, and an enormous amount of work. So what we did, we separated off the artefacts from the samples, and you can see some of the original packaging, some beautiful combs. Some of these have been conserved in the past. We brought all the boxes that we knew had artefacts in them into other premises, and over time, with the help of my colleague there, Chris, we managed to put everything into museum standard boxes and into museum standard packaging. And we had also a lot of help from students, who's probably now a qualified archaeologist herself, and specialists. So it was an enormous undertaking. It took 2 years, from 2010 to 2012, to assess what we had retrieved from the basement, and that was really just the finds and the samples. If we take a look at this, this was a section, or it is a section, running through the early site, the RUX-6 site, which we just brought to publication. Well, it horrifies me. There's Tipp-Ex, there's all sorts of pens, and goodness knows what sort of reinterpretation of material. This was all Ian Crawford trying to make sense of what he had. But the trouble was he was trying to do it by himself. I don't think he was a natural archaeologist, and sometimes people can't separate the wheat from the chaff. And to cut a long story short, what we did, we phased it as best we could, and that gave us a story from modern intrusion, Bronze Age material, environmental events, later Neolithic, early Bronze Age, ploughing and other things, which I'll come to in a minute, the Neolithic, and then natural. So it was a big problem for Ian Crawford. He couldn't actually sort out what was what. He didn't have probably the skills, the patience, and the trouble was, by the time I got to know him, he was already in his 70s. And it's a very daunting task to think that you've got all these sites in the different colours there in the middle of the map, hanging over you like multiple albatrosses, wondering whether you're ever going to get them published. So this is the site we've been working on, RUX-6. I'm presently trying to bring the material from these test excavations, the small test excavations, to a small publication standard. The main problem is this area. I think one of our audience may have worked on. And this area, the Udal South, this is the Udal North, this is the South. And we'll see how we go with time as to what to tell you about those. But I'm going to give you a little rundown as to what happened at RUX-6. Oh, but first of all, yes, to put it into a modern day context. When the book came out this year, the people in North Uist who had experienced the excavation of the Udal said, please come up and give a talk, and we'll do the book launch and everything. And can you take them out to the site? Right, now this was in the middle of May. Middle of May, you think, yeah, you've been short, it's been brilliant sunshine, fantastic weather. You can see hat, fur lining, waterproofs. The wind had started to get up on the way out, and we'd already walked 4 kilometres out to the site, and the wind was at our back. When we turned round, the wind was at our front, and we were walking across the sands, this level expanse of sand, with the tide slowly coming in, and the car park was about 2 kilometres away. And I was almost giving up the will to live. It was a horrendous experience. You were almost doubled up, trying to put one foot in front of the other, given the strength of the wind. So just to sort of put that little, it's a beautiful area, don't get me wrong, it's a fantastically beautiful area, but the weather, that's another matter, sometimes. So, and that, we were actually stood there at the site of the RUX-6, trying to find out where it was, because it had already gone. when I got into the archive and sorted it all out and started to work with the stratigraphy, and we got quite a lot of interesting things. Why I started with the smallest site was that Ian Crawford had actually written something about it. He'd written his version of a narrative account, which wasn't a narrative account, but it was something I could work with, and it was the only site that he had done this with, and he'd phased it as well. And I actually stayed with his phasing, because otherwise it would have been too complicated. So I thought, if you start small, get into his mindset, there might be a chance of working with the bigger sites later on. So what we have here is the site on the edge of an eroding coast. The site was found in about 1970, after there had been an exceptional high tide, and it had cut through part of a Bronze Age monument, which I'll show you in a few moments. But this is the earliest remains that were found. They date to roughly, let's have a look, round about 2700 to 2400 BC, roughly. What we had was a shaft in the bedrock, a deep shaft, because the bedrock had, it was denticulated. It had actually stood up on edge and there was holes. But this was an exceptionally deep one, and that was a piece of the bedrock. And beside it was positioned a vertebra from a fairly, well, a medium-sized whale, shall I say, medium-sized whale, with the, I think it's the neural orifice, apologies if I've got that wrong, pointing into the shaft. Well, Ian Crawford said, well, this is ritual, we have a ritual, something or other. I've forgotten now what he actually called it, because he had very popular names for things. Originally, this could have been a well with water seeping from the bedrock to a low point of the site, because quite a lot of this sand would not have been there when the site was lived at. You can see the whalebone there. It was the monument, whatever it was changed. It became a small cairn of stone, but the orifice, he called it, yes, the orifice was still available for use, whatever that use was. But interestingly, we have this stone packed by other stones, which Ian Crawford called the Great Auk Stone. And for those of you that remember an exhibition in the British Museum probably 30 years ago, where it was exploring some of the best excavations in the UK, this stone and its packing actually went on display. So I managed to track down the booklet that went with the exhibition, but it never mentioned that Great Auk Stone, but never mind. So not only had we got Ian Crawford's account of what he found and what he believed it was, we had to reconcile that with the record, and that wasn't necessarily easy, because a lot of the record had disappeared over time. It had been mutilated by Ian Crawford himself, it had become illegible, a lot of the photographs had disintegrated, slides had disappeared or never returned from their processing. So it's a little bit hit and miss. But beside that, what we still probably think was some sort of ritual monument were two houses, two late Neolithic houses. This one was, you could see 4 large post holes, central hearth, part of the stone and turf wall of the building. This is the coastal erosion. If Ian Crawford had left it another year or so, most of the house would have disappeared. The next door house had other post holes, central hearth. There were room divisions. There were various activities going on in these houses. This one was fairly clean. It had an axe, a late Neolithic axe, sat in some of the turfs of the wall of the house. But this one was probably used for butchery, for pottery manufacture, for stone tool and bone manufacture. So there was a lot going on. And the ritual monuments were over here and the houses there. So there was some connection, although the stratigraphic connection was a wee bit tenuous. Yes, and for those pottery lovers in the audience, please find a piece of late Neolithic grooveware with a large embedded shell inside the clay there as template. So we're very pleased that we can actually date what the activities in these buildings through the pottery and also later to radiocarbon dates. But I don't know if any of you have ever been to Skara Brae on Orkney. And you know, that's on the edge of what was a lagoon. It's now open to the sea and is constantly being eroded. It has an artificial wall holding back the sea. But it's clearly a village. You can see the individual houses. You can see that there is an alleyway running through them. What we had here, I think, may have been similar, but all we had was these two houses. Anything else had long since disappeared into the sea. So it was quite remarkable that Ian Crawford actually found these and excavated them, because they are probably some of the very last remnants of late Neolithic settlement in Namaka areas of the Hebrides. So his excavation was extremely important. Ian Crawford was also very, very interested in new subject areas such as climate change and landscape studies. If you think in about 1970, we never talked about climate change then. It wasn't really in our minds. Changes to the landscape, yes, that was coming in, but probably in Scotland, what Ian Crawford was doing was quite revolutionary at the time. The two houses, these houses had to be abandoned, when a large sand blow and storm took place. And about 30 centimetres of sand was deposited across the remains of the settlement. How long that area was abandoned, because people had obviously had to move inland. Their crops would have been covered, their fields would have been covered in sand as well, so there was no food for the animals, no food for them, so they physically had to move inland and away from the area of blown sand. But there was an interval of time where the sand stabilised and people went back to the area because it was still their territory. Whether it changed or not, it still belonged to somebody. And this, I think, is an important aspect of Ian Crawford's work. There was an attempt to mattock the area, probably a small field. Later, you can just about see the stripes in there, stripes of an ard plough. So the area became cultivated. So there was an attempt to use this new, what was originally old land, but with a new surface of sand and turf. But enigmatically, for Ian Crawford, he could not understand these very large, shallow pits. Dug into the sand, he thought fairly quickly, and then filled in again. Well, I was very lucky during the pulling together of the publication to come across a German publication, in an online publication, of work done on the fine silts and sands of the North German plain, where they too found these pits in lines, in a grid formation, running for long distances. And they had been able to do modern scientific techniques to find out that these pits were used for manuring the land. So presumably domestic debris, cow dung, cattle dung, sheep dung, your own, was put in these pits, covered over, a new pit dug, say the next week or the next month or whatever, and on it went. So eventually your field was fertilised that way. So I thought that was an interesting possibility for why there were so many. There were about 100 of these pits over quite a small area of the excavation. So the sand had stabilised, but that wasn't the end of the landscape changes. Somewhere about the transition between the late Neolithic and the early Bronze Age, somewhere around about 2000 BC, there had been a big storm. Such a big storm that the area of the site, which was here, had been inundated with water, and water that had brought with it a cobble beach, a beach of stone that had covered about half the area of the excavation. And you can see that was about 30 centimetres, no, this will be feet and inches, yes, anybody's guess then. But that was about 30 centimetres of sand accumulation, and then perhaps within 100 years or more, an accumulation of debris over the top, which again put it out of action for agriculture. Well, the next thing that happened was the stabilisation of the beach and the death of individuals. We were very lucky during the post-excavation process of this site to have both students and professionals working with us from Bradford University on the human remains. And this skeleton was clearly identifiable, a young male, deposited in a large, rather beautiful kist, and I'll show you the capping slab in a few moments. We had another skeleton, which I'll come to as well, and then somebody said, well, there's some remains of a third. Where was the third from? So there wasn't a third. Yes, there was a third. It came from grid square something or other. Crawford didn't work in grid squares, so I had to do quite a bit of investigation to find out originally he did. And I found that the third skeleton must have come from this pit here, and it says inhumation, pit inhume care. That was the only evidence I found of the third skeleton, which was in an appalling condition, but was probably also male. And we had sherds, some rather poor sherds of beaker pottery as well, so we knew roughly what sort of date we were in. Here is the capping slab over the very nice skeleton and kist. And what was happening at this time, again, I think the people whose territory this was, decided to make a marker. This was ours. In spite of the turmoil of the sand and the sea, they made a marker on this very difficult terrain. They built what can only be called a cairn right in the heart of their Bronze Age monument. They put a ring of stones around it to become a curb to the cairn. They filled up the gap in between with turf and other stones, and when Ian Crawford actually came across this during the 1970, when it was breached by a high tide, he could see that there was quite a lot of structure beneath the turf. And that's the sort of how the site was found in the first year of excavation. But unbeknown to Ian Crawford, and he found this out during later episodes of excavation at the site, there were other things going on in the Bronze Age. There was a tent-like structure used over many periods of occupation, with a huge amount of burning and hearths. There were movements of the post holes, small post holes. And it was sort of embedded in the dune system that must have developed. A standing stone was erected quite close to it, and this is the cairn with its curb within the body I showed you. But into this structure, probably once it had been abandoned, was another kist was built, and this is it in more detail, into the edge of that structure. And what we have is another male skeleton with the remains of a calf buried with the skeleton, and the remains of a squash pot, a nice Bronze Age pot. Well, interestingly, there was a big discrepancy between the date of the skeleton and the calf that was buried with it. There's probably a 250, 350 year discrepancy. Now, I don't know whether you can see that is highly flexed. The knees of the individual were almost on its chest. And from other work in South Uist by Mike Parker Pearson, who found the remains of mummies beneath the floors of Bronze Age structures there, we think, although it is not fully confirmed, that this was probably an old mummy that had been lying, well, not necessarily lying around, but had to be buried at some point. And the pot and the calf were put with it. So that is the only way we can explain this problem. So we think the skeleton had been curated for probably about 200 to 300 years before being buried. And that's still an ongoing area of interest and science to do with this project. So interesting little bits that came up. But just to show you, before we dive on to the next sites, 1970, coastline was here. By the 80s, this is a stone wall that Ian Crawford built to hold back the tide from his excavation in the 1980s. There was a lot of erosion at the forecourt and the site. And today, as the cover of the publication shows, the site has completely gone. And we managed to put where the cairn was on the picture, but that site completely disappeared. So we managed to find a story or stories in that, and I want to just look at what else we need to do to bring this legacy project towards, I won't use the word final publication, shall I say to a satisfactory publication. I'm dealing with these now. These two have issues. This is the Udal South today. It was a collection of Iron Age wheelhouses. There's quite a lot to see, and it's fenced off now from the cattle, so it's still a viable site worth visiting. You can see from this small inset there were two structures, a third wheelhouse and another structure. Where Erskine Beveridge's souterrain was that he found, I'm not entirely sure yet. It's a discrete excavation of these limited number of buildings. I think there are quite high possibilities that we can do something with it, even though there's no context sheet, there's no real written record at all. Some of the archive has disappeared. But I think we've got all the plans and sections, so we can make a good job of teasing out the evidence from this site, or these sites. We can tell from the finds that we have not just probably late Bronze Age, but late Iron Age occupation of these wheelhouses. Beautiful fretwork cone, part of a horse's head cone, and one of these mysterious painted quartz pebbles. One of the other sites, one of the other wheelhouse sites, produced decorated pottery in a typical Iron Age style for the area, and what I think is probably a very small weaving batten. The wear down here, to me, makes me think it was probably used on a small loom. But we'll see what we can make out of it. This is Ian Crawford in the yellow Mac, having a look at the remains of one of the wheelhouses with what I thought was a child, but it actually must be a fully grown female working on the site. He found a lot of burials of young lambs or neonatal lambs beneath the floors, and again I think Mike Parker Pearson found similar at his late Bronze Age houses in South Uist. So there's a lot to tease out from these structures, and that's what I'm hoping to do. But if we take a quick look at the Udal North. Now, this is 1963. A mass of sand and stone. Beautiful Austin something or other there. For those of you that are specialists in old cars, you'll be drooling at the car in there. Oh, sorry, not too fast. Later on, a few years later, you can see how the top of what was a large sand hill had been breached. There was a National Coal Board bogie and rails bought from the coal board, transported to North Uist to remove sand from the site. And you can see there's a quantity of sand being tipped over the edge of the site and over here. Bits of the bogie still out there, and a handrail, and I keep saying to the local museum, these are actually artifacts now, and they should be removed to the museum. So this was a huge area of sand, and that's what it looks like today. I'm sorry there isn't much definition in there, but this is the mound with its cut off top, and it's not grassed all over. The area where the excavation was is still exposed, although you can't really see any excavated areas. It takes the story forward in time. We leave the Udal South with its late Bronze Age to probably late Iron Age occupation. We move to this much larger area where there were fields on the top of this mound. There were jelly baby-like houses with hearths, with cordoned ware pottery and open jars, quite clearly identifiable Pictish or late Iron Age combs. There was a lot of activity. I have no great knowledge of this area yet. It's one I keep putting away and trying to forget because it's so big. But one day I will approach it. Now, Ian Crawford made a lot of claims about this site, the one being its Viking origin. Well, we certainly have 12th century Norse material. We have a building here, which is a stone-built longhouse. We have bits of bake plate in ceramic, in pottery, beautiful small vessel. In fact, we have two or three of these, and much larger pottery vessel. Viking comb case, silver coin of Harold Hardrada, and a piece of trial work on bone. Everybody who's into Viking Scottish material wants this bit, but the trouble is I can't give it to them like that because I don't know where it fits into the sequence, and I don't know what structures go with what, and we have to work on this and gradually tease out the stratigraphic story so people have something to pin the artifacts to. And the last part of the Udal North was this historical documentation. We've got the dates, 1495, 1596 on the lower one, and about 1697 for the end of the settlement at Udal. Here were the remnants of the Viking longhouse. There's a sort of medieval plain piece in Antler. And the last structures were part of what was believed to be a tacksman's house, who would have received rents from the area to give to the crown or the landowner at that time. So what Ian Crawford did, he found this continuity in history, or more or less continuity in history, not necessarily in the same site, but across that peninsula. And it still remains a very important area for what he found and what he determined all those years ago. What we have done is try to make our small bit of the project valuable to other people. I've given talks before, but ignoring that, when Ian Crawford worked there, the top 3 lines tell you what he did that was a benefit to the local community. He was interested in promoting his views of the site. He produced 1 or 2 small publications summarising bits of the Udal North, but he didn't put a larger publication together. But what we've tried to do since 2008, and especially since 2010-12, was actually make it relevant to the local people that live there. The locals never knew very much about the site. There were no museum displays. People were told to go away, not to disturb the professor, as he was called locally. And I've got some booklets here for those of you that want to take one away. Please do so. I don't want to be carrying them back to Scotland with me. They weigh a bit. And so we've tried to make what he produced relevant. And really, to sum up, because I'm going to have to finish now, is, what do we do next? What can we achieve? I've mentioned this, the Udal South. I think that's achievable. The funding is often is the main issue. There's a willingness amongst people that worked on finds material to carry that forward to publication. In fact, some people who were denied publication over 30 years ago of their PhD have actually cried since, because they've been able to get their work out into the public domain. So I see it as very important that we continue to do this, to use modern science to get the radiocarbon dates, find out the full story of the Udal, and proceed as best we can. And if we can't, we'll have to split up the bits and perhaps give the Viking people the artifacts and let them get on with it, because that might be the only way we can actually achieve knowledge from this site. I think that's about all I need to say. I've been talking for long enough. I will say thank you to our funders, and also to the Royal Archaeological Institute for actually inviting me here today. And if you wish to take a trip to the Outer Hebrides, I'll be very happy to come along and talk to you about the wonderful sites there, not least of all the ones that you can't see. Thank you very much.